Parliament in the UK. British MPs are voting today on whether to back Prime Minister Boris Johnson's plan for the UK to leave the EU on the 31st of January. The EU Withdrawal Agreement Bill will also ban the government from extending the transition period past 2020. Opponents, though, say that the bill leaves the UK's future uncertain and agreeing a trade deal with the EU could take many years. Boris Johnson, buoyed by an 80-strong majority, today claims that it's time for certainty after years of delay. But will the bill come in for criticism from the opposition parties on workers' rights? Well, concerns have also been raised over time left to strike a trade deal with the EU after a new clause was added ruling out extending the transition period before the end of December 2020. Government says today that today's vote will show the UK is now motoring towards the 31st January departure date. Well, for more on this, we're now joined by our correspondent in the UK, Stuart Smith. Stuart, thanks very much indeed for joining us. So, all eyes on Westminster. Has the vote happened?
Yes, it has. In the last 2 minutes, we got the result, and to the surprise of nobody, Boris Johnson and his Conservative Party have secured a majority. So the vote went ahead, and indeed MPs have voted in favour of the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, which does mean that the UK is on course now to leave the EU by the end of January, and also to have the transition completed by the end of 2020.
And in effect, this is what the whole election was about, so that he could have this majority, a gamble that paid off, and so the process now well and truly on track.
Yeah, well and truly on track, and Boris Johnson will be very pleased because he can now say to people he is getting Brexit done, and it will be done by January 31st. But like you say, there are many in opposition. In fact, all of the opposition parties disagree with what's just happened today. They all voted against this bill. They're worried that no deal is now back on the table. That means that Britain would fall out of the EU without a deal, potentially jeopardising the UK economy. And they say that by Boris Johnson putting this firm date at the end of 2020 in law, that's a very risky move, and most opposition parties are not in favour of him doing that. So they've voted against, but with Boris Johnson's huge majority, it doesn't matter what they vote for. Yeah. He's managed to secure what he needed.
And those opposition parties, I guess, have to kind of acknowledge that this in many ways was a second referendum on Brexit, and that the British people have spoken in their numbers and they said, yes, for sure, let's get Brexit done.
Yeah, they did. And the Labour Party says that, sure, some of them say, indeed, let's get Brexit done. But the line from the Labour Party is that this deal, this agreement that was put forward today is the wrong one. And it's, in the words of Jeremy Corbyn, a terrible deal. He believes Labour Party could have got one even better. But very few Labour MPs did indeed vote for this bill. A few rebels, but not many. And those rebels would have been from the Brexit voting constituencies, those that originally voted Leave, where there's a lot of pressure on the MPs representing those areas to show that they do want Brexit to take place.
All right, so this deal that's on the table, has this been agreed by the EU already, or is this what they're going to take for the next phase of discussion?
Yeah, what's on the table now and what's been agreed and voted upon was agreed with the EU in October. What's been voted on in the UK Parliament is a bill to ratify what the EU agreed. So it gets complex. Right. But this is the UK saying that, indeed, we agree with the deal that Boris Johnson's come back with, and we will put it into law. However, the EU are worried because what they didn't originally expect was to have to finish these future negotiations over just 11 months. Normally trade deals, especially with such a big bloc as the EU, take years to negotiate. And Boris Johnson says and has promised that he will get it done within 11 months. And as he's put in this bill, he's put that in law, that he will get it done by the end of 2020. It's a bit odd that the government is making laws to constrain itself. It's clearly a symbolic move from Mr. Johnson, and he could, if he needed the extra time, with his giant majority, simply overturn that law and give himself a few more extra months or even years.
All right. So
but the deal is what's been agreed with the EU, and in principle should be it.
So just to get some clarity for me in my head, so what we're saying is there's a deal on the table which is clear about almost everything and includes a clause that says subject to an agreed trade deal between the EU and Britain going forward. And that may take a year, all things being equal, but probably longer. What if we get to December 2020 and they haven't agreed? Is that where the no-deal Brexit then kicks in?
That's it. That's the no-deal Brexit, which refuses to go away. The Boris Johnson proponents, the Conservative Party, they are using this as leverage. They want to be able to say to the EU, look, if you don't manage to get this deal in 11 months, we're just going to leave without a deal altogether. Now, some countries, including South Africa, have already agreed to continue with the current trade deal they have with the EU. So using what's effectively an EU law and just rolling it over. So in the event of a no deal, South Africa and a few other countries around the world won't experience dropping back to World Trade Organization rules. But for the UK and for a lot of other countries in the world, that would be a big problem and a big hit to the economy.
All right, so trade deals to one side. The ordinary Briton who used to be able to just get on the train, get to Le Havre or Calais and just cross into France, for example, what is this going to mean going forward?
Well, for those people, it depends on what's negotiated in the next 11 months. But the EU has said that they will try and organise some kind of scheme which would be very cheap for travellers and wouldn't require too much extra paperwork to travel over to the EU. Perhaps something similar to what the UK currently has with the US and Canada, a kind of arrangement where you don't need to get a full visa, you just need to apply for a very simple pass, which would allow you into the rest of the continent. But most people certainly are less worried about that and more worried, I think, about the economic consequences and the fact that a lot of domestic legislation, some things people are really passionate about, has just been pushed down the line for years.
All right, so what about holidays to Ibiza, Spain, and all the traditional hotspots for the Brits? That'll continue, I guess.
Yep, well, they are very popular, and I think most people assume that when things come to crunch, the EU and the UK will sort something out. It would look very bad for the Conservative Party to say, sorry, you can no longer go on holiday, and they're not going to allow that to happen. But the question is how they make sure it doesn't happen.
All right. Thanks very much indeed. We're going to have to leave it there, but we got in just as the nick of time for that result. And so there you have it. No surprise to anybody. The British Parliament has voted in favour of the deal. So it looks as if at the end of January, Britain will be out of the EU and they'll be working on trade deals for the rest of the year. Now,